What's up, everyone? Thanks for joining us for another edition of the Frary Smith Podcast. It's Wednesday, March 20th, and we're excited to be back with episode 188 of the show after some technical difficulties today. In the spirit of March Madness, we'll be ranking our top 5 upsets in recent Sunbelt history. But partner, before we get to that, I got to say it's good to see you. It's been a while since we've recorded an episode. I'm looking forward to getting back on the proverbial horse.
Yeah, it's definitely been a minute, a good, much needed break, I think, for both of us, but not really much of a break for you. I know you were busy covering some tournament action when it comes to basketball. I know we're both excited about March Madness, and just a kudos to you and a shout out to you for definitely doing some elite coverage of some basketball tournaments the last couple weeks.
Yeah, partner, I had a lot of fun. Got to do the Sunbelt women's basketball tournament, first 12 games there, and then was able to drive up to Huntsville, Alabama to do the Conference USA women's basketball tournament. So you're right. I got to admit, I'm a little bit tired. Did 19 games in 11 days, 23 teams. So it was a wild ride, but that's what March is all about. Got some buzzer beaters, got some great games, and it was definitely a high being a part of that. But I know too, you're getting set for this move. How are the prep going for that? I know this move's coming up in about a week.
Yeah, the prep's going slow for the listeners that know I'll be moving to Nashville to work in person for On3. Definitely excited about that and the opportunity. I actually haven't met any of my coworkers yet in person just because I've been fully remote this whole entire time. So definitely excited to meet some people in person, but definitely not excited about moving. You know me, no, I'm not good at moving. I do not like moving, but can't wait for that to all be done and be set up in a new spot for sure.
Well, I got to admit, and I'll tell our listeners, I know Caden and I are both foodies, so if you live near Nashville, if you've been to Nashville, and you've got some food recommendations, drop a comment on YouTube, hit us up on Twitter. Let's send Caden to Nashville with some great places to eat as he gets set for that move. But before we get to today's show, I want to tell you about our last episode since it was a while back. We broke down the 2024 Sunbelt football schedule. We talked about who has the easiest schedule, who are some teams that have extremely challenging roads ahead in 2024. We reviewed our midweek mania games that'll take place this coming year and even broke down the schedules for App State, for James Madison, Texas State, and Troy. We did a lot more on that episode. You definitely want to go back and give it a watch or a listen wherever you consume the show. But on today's show, it's in the spirit of March Madness. We're going to be ranking our biggest Sunbelt football upsets over the last 5 seasons. We're going to rank our top 5 upsets and discuss several matchups that just missed the mark. But, Cato, last time we were together, we broke down the 2024 schedule. I know we're both excited at the opportunities that the Sun Belt is going to have. I believe the number was 19 in total against Power 4 teams, and I think you and I envisioned some big wins coming against those Power 4 squads. But when you look over the past 5 years, the upsets that have taken place by Sunbelt teams over Power 5 teams, you clearly see a conference that's continuing to rise in terms of national prominence.
Yeah, no, I think historically and especially in recent history, when you look at just the track record that the Sun Belt has against these Power 5 or Power 4 schools moving forward, and just in the past, you can't help but feel like if you're in that position as a bigger school, if you're taking your draw or making your pick as far as programs you want to play, you probably don't want to particularly play one in the Sun Belt, just given what they were able to do. I'm thankful to be on a couple teams that have played in some tight matchups and gotten some wins over some Power 5 schools. But even thinking back to my playing days, when you watch film of schools year in and year out, you feel like there's always one or two on the Sun Belt schedule that you have to play that you kind of put the film up and can see that they played well or found a way to beat a Power 5 opponent that had some really elite tape out there. So I think when you think about this conference as a whole, it really speaks to kind of some of the parity we see in the competitiveness. We talked last season about how this could arguably be one of the most competitive, if not the most competitive league across college football. And I think a great product of that is when you take these schools away from playing each other and see how they play against some of the top competition and how often they're able to rise to the occasion. So definitely excited to celebrate some of these wins we've seen in history and get into the March Madness spirit with some upset talk.
Yeah, I think back to comments that we've heard Mac Brown make at North Carolina about playing that App State team. You look at the ACC, they've kind of been, ducking the Sun Belt here moving forward, or at least wanting those games at home. So definitely interesting. The Sun Belt definitely building a reputation kind of as a giant slayer in college football. But Cato, we promised breaking down the top 5 upsets over the last 5 years. I know we've got a few honorable mentions. Should we start with those honorable mentions and then work our way up the list?
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. Give our listeners some suspense and talk about some of the honorable mentions and then get into that 5-1 and crown our best game, our best upset win in the last 5 years. Let's do it.
Love it. Let's jump right in. And so for honorable mentions here, we're going to start with a couple of games that, Caden, I know that are near and dear to your heart. You played in these games, and they were 2 wins for App State during that 2019 season. App State first takes down North Carolina 34-31 on September 21st, 2019. And then they take down South Carolina later in the year, that game that Nick Ross had that big late interception in that showing to take down the Gamecocks. But Cato, when I look at these 2 games, and the reason they're not ranked higher is that neither North Carolina or South Carolina had great years that year. I think North Carolina had the better year. They ended up winning a bowl game that year, but they were just 7-6 on the season. South Carolina finishes 4-8. But the one thing that did stand out to me about both of these matchups was how loaded App State's roster was that year.
Yeah, that 2019 team was definitely special. No, there's no doubt about it. When I think back to my playing days and playing on that team, I don't think there's any question that that was the App State team that you could say could go toe-to-toe with really anybody, give them their best shot and play a fantastic game. And I think you saw that with the 2 Power 5 wins we were able to get in that season. I think you look back to some of the times this team came up close. I think the North Carolina win really represented this team kind of getting that monkey off of their back after coming up short so many times against Power 5 opponents. Finally getting that win was huge. It was the first season that Mac Brown was back at North Carolina. And I think what really stands out about that game to me personally is how, if that probably would have been a year later, how this maybe would have cracked and made it into the top 5. You talk about the talent on that team with Sam Howell at quarterback. You have Javonte Williams and Michael Carter at running back, 2 guys that are still in the NFL to this day. Tamon Fox and Chaz Surratt, who are also still playing at the highest level right now. If that would have been a year later, if it maybe wasn't a freshman Sam Howell, and it was the next season where we saw that North Carolina team go to the Orange Bowl and play against Texas A&M and really have one of their better years the last couple seasons, you might have this game in the top 5. But I think looking at the ending of the game and the dramatic blocked field goal by Akeem Davis-Gaither, they're definitely a memory that'll be remembered for a long time in Boone. And that one being a shootout just gave you kind of the complete opposite when you look at the South Carolina game. You have a low-scoring matchup. Well, I'll never forget going into that week of preparation and just getting into that game plan and realizing that the South Carolina team was one of the more stubborn SEC teams that felt like when they played smaller schools, they could be a little bit more vanilla with their game plan. And they were extremely predictable in that game, but there's no question if you ask anyone who played in that game, even them being predictable, that was a big physical team, a true SEC opponent when you look at the talent, and just a low-scoring rock fight, a ball of dust kind of football game where we get the 20-15 win. I think we only scored 1 offensive touchdown in that matchup, but just 2, I think, hallmark wins, not for App State, but for the Sun Belt as a whole. When you look at what Sun Belt teams are capable of doing, and getting 2 in 1 year was definitely huge and super memorable.
Well, and Caden, I forgot to mention as well, I think the other thing that stood out to me, we've talked about, some of the injuries that you've dealt with in your career, missing some big non-conference games, but, having a great season once Sun Belt play turned around. You had 5 tackles in that North Carolina game, so that's worth bringing up here on the Frary Smith Podcast.
Yeah, it's a crazy one, though. When you look at the depth we actually had to use that year, the defense had guys dropping like flies, especially in the secondary. There was a ton of guys having cramps, so it was really our first game playing in hot weather. So a young Caden Smith got thrown into the fire, did pretty well, got himself some tackles, but it was definitely a collective effort, and one of those games where you go on the bus afterwards and you look around, and it's really fun, and you can enjoy the win a lot more because literally every single person that had a seat on that bus felt like they got some playing time and had their fingerprints on that win.
I think you said it best. It's a memory that's going to last a lifetime for a lot of those Mountaineer faithful, as well as players that were on those 2 teams, and still the only Sun Belt team in the last 5 years to pull off 2 Power 5 wins in the same year. But moving on to, I think in my mind, was kind of our 6th best game or 6th biggest upset over the last 5 years, and that was Georgia Southern's 45-42 win over Nebraska during that big weekend that also saw Marshall take down Notre Dame, App State take down Texas A&M. That was September 10th, 2022. And Caden, I got to admit, I wanted to find a way to get this one in the top 5 because it was one of my favorite games. You think back to Kyle Van Treese and some of the big plays that he made down the stretch. And that one was just an absolute shootout. And I think the other fun storyline of that game was that led to Nebraska beginning the season 1-2, and Scott Frost was actually fired following this game after Georgia Southern walked into Nebraska and won the football game.
Yeah, this is one of the many games we'll talk about that just had a domino effect and a butterfly effect, and you see how it impacts different things. So I think if Nebraska this season maybe has a great year under Matt Rule with Dylan Raiola under center, maybe we can kind of translate it and bring it back to this moment right here where Georgia Southern was able to get that upset win that led to the eventual firing of Scott Frost. But you mentioned it, Noah. This game might not have made the top five for us, but I feel like it definitely might be the top one or two most exciting and intriguing matchups to watch when it comes to these games we're talking about. I mean, you talk about this game being an absolute shootout between Kyle Van Treese and Casey Thompson, a guy who's highly regarded recruit who's played at a couple different spots in college football. And you can really just look at the numbers in this matchup. You talk about a game where both teams eclipse 500 yards total when it comes to offense. Georgia Southern posting 642 yards of offense, Nebraska 575. Not much defense was played in this game necessarily, but boy, did it make for an exciting shootout that you mentioned. Came down to an 11-play drive that was capped off by Kyle Van Treese running in that touchdown with less than 30 seconds left in the game, or less than a minute in the game rather. So just definitely a game I think I'll remember, as far as if you watched it, you were there, you felt like you were in the house, and really getting a first chance to see this Georgia Southern offense that we've now come accustomed to watching really have a coming out party and have an elite performance against a Big Ten opponent.
Yeah, Caden, I think maybe what we find is maybe we need to have an episode where we talk about our top 5 games over the last several years, because this one, it would be in it. I think the App North Carolina game 2 years ago would definitely be in it. So there's a lot of, really strong games, a lot of fun games to have watched over the last couple of years. But let's jump into the meat of the program here and talk about our top 5 upsets over the last 5 seasons in the Sun Belt. And we'll start with a game that took place this past season in September 16th, 2023, South Alabama winning 33-7 over Oklahoma State. And Caden, South Alabama looked dominant in this game early. They scored 23 unanswered points. And I think the biggest takeaway from me, Ollie Gordon, who ended up becoming the NCAA's top rusher a season ago, had just 3 rushes for 12 yards in this game. That South Alabama defense did a really nice job on him. And there was just some interesting aspects of this game. Obviously, Oklahoma State ends up finishing 10-4 on the season. They play for a Big 12 championship. So this was a huge win for South Alabama and deserving of being number 5 in terms of top 5 upsets over the last 5 years in the Sun Belt.
Yeah, this one definitely cracks the top 5, but I feel like it doesn't make it much further just because a lot of the things you mentioned right there. I think when you look at this Oklahoma State team this season, I think it was very clear they didn't have their stuff figured out when you look at the first 4 weeks of the season. I mean, they started off the year 2-2. They had a really close wins over Central Arkansas and Arizona State to start the season. And you mentioned kind of the Ollie Gordon factor of this. This is a guy who was a first-team All-American who entered the season with 1,700 yards on the ground and 21 touchdowns. But in this game, they clearly weren't as trustworthy of him, didn't figure out that he was their lead back just yet, and he really went on his tear after this game. They didn't even have things figured out at quarterback in this game. You saw 3 different quarterbacks playing this game as well. So this Oklahoma State team was definitely different from when South Alabama played it in this matchup versus the end of the season when they found themselves in that Big 12 championship, nearly running the table versus their Big 12 opponents in the regular season. But you have to tip your cap off to South Alabama for what they were able to do in this game. This is obviously a team that I had high expectations for last season, and I think this game kind of shows you why those expectations were there. You mentioned starting off the game with that 23-0 run. I think about them holding a Big 12 opponent to 3 straight scoreless quarters to start the game off. You just have to tip your cap off, like I said, to this defense specifically for what they were able to do, for their ability to run the ball. You saw 47 rushes in this game. LaDamian Webb taking care of business with 2 touchdowns and 151 yards. Carter Bradley playing very efficient in this game, 10 for 16 with 2 touchdowns. Really a perfect balance of offensive and defensive attack in this game, and what it really takes to beat a Power 5 opponent when you play them in the beginning of the season or the end of the season. So kudos to South Alabama for making the cut in this one. Just wish, obviously, that it would have lived up to this hype and played like this more throughout last season.
Yeah, that has to be the biggest what if, Caden, because when you saw them take down Oklahoma State the way you did, you thought that maybe some of the preseason hype about South Alabama being a potential New Year's Six bowl game, a participant in that Fiesta Bowl could have happened. It just never did this past year, but still a great upset for South Alabama and ranked here inside our top 5. But moving on to number 4, this was App State's win over number 6 Texas A&M. It took place during that big weekend that Marshall also beat Notre Dame, and I can tell you that's going to be on the list in a few moments. But this is still the highest ranked opponent that a Sun Belt team has taken down in the last 5 years. Michael Hughes kicking the game-winning field goal with just over 8 minutes to go. And Caden, I think the other interesting elements of this game were, again, some of the ripple effects. It was widely reported that Texas A&M was going to host College Game Day that next week had they won this game, but instead App State wins, steals their College Game Day, and partner, that allowed you and me to have a great weekend up in Boone.
Yeah, I'll never forget having kind of on my calendar mark that I was going to go see App State and James Madison play, and then all of a sudden it gets announced that App State's getting College Game Day, and had to call a quick audible and make it up there. But you mentioned the ripple effect. This game kind of breeded College Game Day coming to App State, gave us the Troy Miracle on the Mountain Part 2 when you see App State getting that win, and kind of truly sparked Troy going on their championship run and winning their championship. So a lot of things definitely came out of this game, and I think when you look at this matchup, it's a really kind of a toss-up between this game and South Alabama's win over Oklahoma State, just because you're comparing a team that maybe didn't live up to their ranking when you look at them at the end of the season versus a team that was able to turn things around and garner themselves a better ranking at the end of the season. But I think we have this one a little bit more ahead just because you look at the SEC talent that was in this game and just the talent overall. This Texas A&M team brought in an incredible recruiting class right before this, and their offensive line and defensive line was absolutely stout, just 300-pounders left and right. And App State was just able to do in this game what they've done a lot of times against Power 5 opponents, and that's just play incredible defense and kind of contort the game to their will. I mean, you look at what they were able to do slowing down this offense in this matchup. Only 180 total yards, 97 through the air for Texas A&M, and just 83 rushing yards for an SEC team on the road, playing in front of that 12th man in Kyle Field. Truly impressive when you look at what they were able to do in this matchup. And I think overall, when you look at just kind of those elements like we talk about that it takes to beat a Power 5 opponent, keeping the composure, being on the road and against the SEC opponent is definitely something that deserves to be in this top 5 ranking. And of course, biasly, super happy that it made the cut, that App State was able to get a upset victory up here on the rankings.
Well, and I think your point about playing at Kyle Field in front of that 12th man, over 100,000 people there. Texas A&M ended up not having a great season in 2021 there. But they ultimately, you're still playing in front of 100,000 people, and it made that game extremely interesting. So definitely deserving of being at number 4 on this list. But moving on to number 3, this is Georgia State's 38-30 win over Tennessee that took place on August 31st, 2019. And Caden, Dan Ellington was the starting quarterback in this game. He was a two-time All-Sun Belt quarterback during his career. And I think, again, what stands out to me was 3 consecutive touchdowns that were scored by Georgia State in the fourth quarter. They left Neyland Stadium, another just ruckus environment, absolutely stunned. And Tennessee does go on to end up having a good season. They finish 8-5. They win the Tax Slayer Gator Bowl 23-22. So this one was impressive for me and deserving of being inside the top 3.
For sure, no. And you talk about the SEC pedigree, that definitely just holds a little bit more weight. And when you talk about road environments, it doesn't get much crazier than Neyland Stadium. You talk to people within the SEC, and a lot of them will tell you this is the hardest place to play in the entire conference, maybe in the entire country, as far as them being able to put 100,000 plus in their stadium consistently, having their bowl to where the stadium and the crowd really feels on top of you. We played there in 2016, and some teammates told me it was absolutely insane. And when you look at that 2016 team and this team as well, 2 of the better teams we've seen come out of Tennessee in the last decade, I think. You look at this team and you mentioned them ending the season with 8 wins. Their only losses really came after a slow 0-2 start, including this game, to ranked SEC opponents. So you have to tip your cap off to Georgia State for beating one of the better teams in the SEC this season. And look no further than the talent they had on their offensive side of the ball specifically. You talk about Ty Chandler, a guy who's playing for the Minnesota Vikings right now, got some starts last year. Eric Gray as well, coming out of the backfield, who's an NFL guy. And then a receiving core headlined by Juwan Jennings, who we literally just saw maybe make one of the biggest plays in the Super Bowl, throwing a touchdown pass to Christian McCaffrey. Josh Palmer and Marquez Callaway are still wearing NFL helmets right now as well, as 2 of the fastest guys in the league. So I think when you look at them able to play a strong defensive game, give up some touchdowns, but be able to keep your composure and respond offensively was huge. This was a stout Tennessee defense as well. And just have to give a shout out to Dan Ellington for doing his thing, playing an amazing game, scoring 2 touchdowns through the air, 1 on the ground, kind of establishing that culture as the dual threat quarterback model that we've seen be successful at Georgia State the last couple of years. He's a big part of that. This game was a big part of that as far as their momentum and recruiting things, and just arguably, I think maybe inarguably, the best win for this program when you look at their 15-year history.
Yeah, and I think that's the point right there, a 15-year history for Georgia State, and you look at a Tennessee program whose history goes back almost 100 years at this point. So huge upset for Georgia State in the early infancy of their program. And, perhaps under the new coaching staff, maybe more are to come in the future. But moving on to number 2 on our list, this was Coastal Carolina's win over BYU, who was ranked 8th in the country at the time. This one took place December 5th, 2020. And again, another interesting backstory behind this game. This game actually should have never happened, but Liberty, was not able to play in this game. So on 1 week's notice, BYU traveled across the country. It was Mormons versus Mullets, and we got an incredible game. College game day was in Conway. And Kane, I think another thing that stands out, you talk about some of the NFL pieces on this list of teams that have been played by Sunbelt schools. Zach Wilson was the quarterback of BYU. He ended up going number 2 overall in that draft later that year. Obviously, hasn't had a great NFL career, but still was an incredible college player. 4 other players get drafted as well. And then Coastal side, you have Isaiah Likely, who ends up becoming a 4th-round draft pick. Grayson McCall, obviously still on the team. And Kane, this one was a 1-point game until 12 minutes to go before CJ Maribel had that late touchdown. So just an electric game from start to finish, and one of the bigger wins for a Sunbelt team over the last 5 years.
Yeah, I think when it comes to Sunbelt lore and intrigue, when you look at the recent history of this conference, this game really stacks up high. You talk about the Mormons versus Mullets matchup, just a lot of juice and energy surrounding this one, the interesting storylines when it comes to this being a last-minute game, 2 ranked opponents, college game day. It's everything you want in a college football matchup. And I think even looking back, if I remember correct, the BYU athletic director actually sent their equipment down to Conway or over to Conway on a Wednesday before this game was even scheduled, just to prove and show how much they wanted to play in it. You have to think back to this time period, and I remember it vividly. These were 2 teams that were both undefeated coming into this matchup, both ranked and both vying for that spot in the Cotton Bowl to represent the independent teams or the group of 5 in that game. BYU wanted to add another check to their resume as far as beating a ranked opponent on the road. They got what they wanted as far as the matchup, but they did not get the result. And I think another reason why this ranks so high is, as you mentioned, from a talent standpoint, when it comes to playing quarterback, and we know how important the quarterback position is in this game. You have to beat the other team's quarterback in pretty much every game you play. It doesn't get much better than Zach Wilson. This is the most talented player, I think, on this list, top to bottom by far. You can say what you want about his NFL career, but this season specifically for him is what garnered him being that number 2 overall pick in the draft. We think back to his arm talent, what he was able to do at pro day and on the field in his college career. One of the best quarterback seasons we've seen kind of in the independent / group of 5 level. And this was the only game of the season that he threw for just 1 touchdown pass, also had an interception, just 240 yards. It was definitely the worst game of the season. And when I think back to this game, I remember vividly how well Coastal Carolina's defense was able to be physical with him, the entire team, make him uncomfortable. And that had a huge edge as far as them being able to get the win. Not to mention he was handing the ball off to Tyler Algier, who's been playing fantastic for the Atlanta Falcons the last couple of years. So I have to give kudos to Coastal Carolina for not just winning this game, but providing one of the most, I think, iconic moments when you look at the Sun Belt Conference in the last couple of years.
Well, and I think back to, again, that pressure on Zach Wilson and some of the clips that still circulate on social media, some of the Coastal guys, throwing Zach Wilson into the turf in that game. So definitely an interesting one and well-deserving of being on this list here in the top 5. But moving on to our number 1 upset over the last 5 years in the Sun Belt, and that was Marshall's 26-21 win over number 8 Notre Dame. Took place on September 10th, 2022. And this one was interesting because it was an absolute back-and-forth battle. Stephen Gilmore had that late interception for a touchdown that ultimately gave Marshall the win. We saw some great NFL draft talent in this one as well. Michael Mayer, who ends up becoming a 2nd-round draft pick that year, played in this game. And Gain, I think what still stands out to me about this contest was how elite Marshall's defense was. You had Andre Sam, you had Gilmore, you had Neal, Porter. There were so many nice pieces. And then on top of it, you win this game with a guy who would become your backup quarterback the rest of the year in Henry Colombi. So this one it will go down as one of the best upsets of all time in Sunbelt history, and certainly well-deserving of being the top Sunbelt upset over the last 5 years.
Yeah, you mentioned it. No, you definitely get bonus points if you're able to pull off an upset like this with your backup quarterback, a guy who ends up not being your starter for the remainder of the season. And I think when you compare a lot of these teams throughout this order, you look at this number 8 ranked Notre Dame team. And it was, I think, a team that could stand toe to toe and beat probably every single team on this list. They didn't have the strongest start to the season. They stubbed their toe against Stanford. And then their only other loss of the season came to a USC team that was led by Heisman Trophy winning quarterback in that season, the specific season he won the Heisman Trophy, Caleb Williams. So this team was absolutely loaded. You mentioned Michael Mayer, probably coming in right behind Zach Wilson as far as best college players on this entire list. But you also have guys like Audric Estime at running back, Joe Alt, who'll probably be the top tackle taken in this draft, Ben Morrison, J.D. Bertrand are studs. This team was absolutely loaded all around, yet Marshall was able to come into this game and play elite. And I think what stands out to me the most as far as this game is the best players for Marshall playing their best, which is what you normally need when you want to pull out an upset like this. You talk about a guy like Kalen LeBourne taking just a monster load of 31 carries in this game, and in the game with 163 yards and a score. The two biggest defensive difference makers, and Micah Abraham and Owen Porter, both getting 2 interceptions, 2 of the 3 teams' picks in the entire game for this one. So I think when you look at everything and all the pieces kind of coming together, playing in an iconic environment against an iconic team like Notre Dame, and Marshall being able to put it together and beat a top 10 ranked opponent, I think it rightfully gets the crown of number 1 upset in the last 5 years for sure.
Yeah, again, environment plays a big aspect of these rankings, and doing it at Notre Dame, a program with north of 100 years of history, doing it in front of Touchdown Jesus. What a win for Marshall, and certainly something that Marshall Thundering Herd fans will remember for many years to come. But that'll do it for today's episode. We hope you all enjoyed our discussion of the top 5 Sun Belt football upsets over the last 5 years. Before you go, don't forget, we're going to be back tomorrow. We're venturing out of the Sun Belt football world, but for a good reason. We'll be debuting a Sun Belt basketball March Madness preview, including some special guests from James Madison and Marshall. You're definitely going to want to give that a listen. That'll do it for us here at the Frary Smith Podcast. Before you go, here's all that we ask. Leave us a 5-star review. Drop a comment on your way out. Tell us what you're enjoying about the show or what we could be doing better. We love hearing from you, our listeners. So for Caden Smith, Richmond Weaver, and Brett Jemis, I'm Noah Frary. We really appreciate you spending more time with us today. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.